government fails, the world's off its rails, leaders are whacked, democracy is under attack. It's time to get smart, folks, time to get real. Let's cut through the crap, tell us how you feel. Let's cue the talent, let's meet the host. Podcast by George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome on in to another podcast by George. Well, things are heating up out there, literally, it seems like, with the climate, but also politically. It's not going to get better in any circumstance, folks. I mean, I think the climate is going to continue to deteriorate, and politics, the season is warming up, and it's going to deteriorate as well, and we're going to talk about all of that and then some with our friend, our old buddy, our old pal, Dr. Stephen W. Schmidt is coming back on Podcast by George. Dr. Politics is the Professor Emeritus of Political Science from Iowa State University. He spent 50 years in the classroom trying to teach dummies like me about politics. Now, I didn't go to his particular university, but I got his book, American Government and Politics Today. Read that book, folks. Order that on Amazon, and you'll be a smart guy. I read it. I'm not a smart guy, but I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there, even for people like me. But let's welcome him on in. Doc, welcome back to a podcast by George.
Thanks. I'm so glad you invited me back.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to have you on the show. And, you know, a lot of times we start off with my little soliloquy, which I've already kind of done, and then I'll have some questions for you. But I like to change things up once in a while because I've been doing these podcasts now. Believe it or not, I just passed the 3-year mark. We've been doing them in video for over 2 years, and I want to start this off with a video clip here to kind of get our blood boiling, get us started, and then we'll talk about that. And a lot of folks may have seen this, but I want to bring this video clip up. Let's take a look. Okay, to set this up a little bit, this is a presser and a news conference for an upcoming fight or something in the boxing world. Evander Holyfield is the boxer that you're seeing on screen there, and he's going to finish up with his comment here very shortly. And then Donald Trump, a former president of the United States, is calling into this thing. Folks, you got to listen to this and also what. Now, there's Evander, Doc. I don't know if you want to comment on this. I don't know that girl standing next to him there. I tell people, we talk all the time on the podcast about Silicon Valley and its influence on American politics. I would call that Silicon Valley for anybody that's watching the podcast. Holy buckets. Well, anyway, this is the kind of venue that our illustrious former president of the United States really enjoys and what he may be best at. But let me give this a roll here.
MMA, I wouldn't do that because I know you probably hurt me, but not in boxing. So I'm always doing things to my advantage. That's the reason I can do this in this short period of time. I'm 58 years old, but I'm in shape, and I do well for my age.
Joined alongside by the former President of the United States of America, Donald J. Trump, ladies and gentlemen.
Here he comes.
You said, if I had to box somebody?
Anybody.
I think probably my easiest fight would be Joe Biden because I think he'd go down very, very quickly. Very, very quickly. You know, he once said, I'd like to take him behind the bar, and he'd be in big trouble if he ever did. Now, I think Biden would go down within the first few seconds.
The first few seconds?
Okay, so what I want to say, Doc, is that I go back a ways. I mean, I can remember clear back to the glory days. I can remember Camelot a little bit. I can remember John Kennedy. And, of course, LBJ I remember pretty well on the television set as a kid. And then I really became of age and became aware politically with Richard Nixon and so on. But, my God, I have never seen anything like this. This is a former president of the United States threatening to knock out unconscious. I mean, it's silliness, but still, the current president of the United States. Doc, what do you make of this with your experience and knowledge of the American political scene 50-plus years?
Oh, you know, the truth is we no longer respect the idea of a president who got elected, regardless of who it is, and that is kind of the historically most important authority, someone that, most countries would be happy to have a legitimate individual leading the country. And it's all become essentially a war of words, a lot of disrespect on both sides. And I think it's very dangerous. I mean, that's all we have. We have a president. Sometimes those presidents go off the track, and then hopefully someone else will step in to prevent catastrophic disaster like a nuclear war from happening, which we're seeing now in the news with General Milley, who called his Chinese counterpart and said, "Don't worry, we're not going to launch any nuclear war on you. So, please calm down." That happened, by the way, with Richard Nixon before. The news media has been terrible in reporting all this, but Richard Nixon, when he resigned, lost the election, was very depressed, was drinking a lot. Yeah. And the major sort of commanders and the Secretary of Defense were extremely worried that he would launch a war. And when Nixon got on the plane, he held the fingers up, got on the plane and left Washington. They had already taken away the briefcase that has the nuclear launch code and given it to the vice president because they were so worried that in his condition, he might launch a nuclear war. And Nixon had said to members of the Senate, he said, I am incredibly powerful. And in 25 minutes, I can launch a nuclear war and kill hundreds of millions of people in the world. He had said that. That was what was called the madman theory, which Nixon invented, which was the idea that in order to scare other countries into complying with the U.S., he could pretend to be crazy and might launch a nuclear war. Well, that's not a game. So, we're in that same situation now. We've got this discussion about General Milley worried about President Trump's condition after he lost the election, which, by the way, Republicans and members of Donald Trump's own staff said he was completely out of control and frightening when he realized that he might have lost the election. His own people were saying that. So we're in this odd situation now. Donald Trump is a great showman and an entertainer, and he did a lot of that. He was somewhat of a real estate guy too. But if we want to elect people like that for president, we can expect them to, do what he just did with extreme boxing, showing up, on the phone to basically trash the current president. That's that's just what happens.
When Trump was elected, when he was campaigning, I was telling people that my primary concern or worry with Donald Trump wasn't necessarily his politics. I mean, he's not a person that holds a lot of political views.
Right.
The point with him was he was an example of the celebration, really, of the coarsening of America. And I'm not just talking about, parlor politeness here. I'm talking about, and not even the vulgarity. Hell, I can be vulgar at times, but the celebration of ignorance and of racism and misogyny, and that stuff has always been present. That stuff has been held by former presidents, but he was the guy that put it on the front stage. And my concern has always been that it would energize other like-minded individuals that would just continue to push the envelope. And of course, that really, to my mind, is what happened on January 6th. That was the greatest danger of Donald Trump. It wasn't that he was, for instance, the worst warmonger that we've ever had as a president, because his warmongering was not that bad. He was horrible for the climate, mostly because of inaction, but he also took action that was horrible for the climate also. But I want to bring up this next piece here, now that we're talking about former presidents and warmongering. Let's take a look at this. Okay, so this is Matt Taibbi. Now, he's been on the podcast before. He's kind of a left-wing guy out there, a former Rolling Stone writer, a great author. He really understands what's going on in the country, and he took great note of this. And I just got to tell people this, and it has to do with the problem in this country being bipartisan. This is a perfect example. Democrats swoon over George W. Bush in Match Made in Hell. After George W. Bush gave a speech comparing 9/11 to January 6th, a parade of high-profile Democrats stepped over the grave of American liberalism, quote unquote, to praise him. Former President and one-time Ultimate Blue Party villain George W. Bush gave a speech Saturday commemorating 9/11 at the crash site of Flight 93 in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. That's the one where the passengers brought it down. Much of what is said was totally quite like the speeches of his presidency, denouncing the evildoers, praising American resilience, calling for pride in our wounded nation. Then he shifted gears. Quote, this is old Bush. He says, We have seen growing evidence that the dangers to our country can come not only across borders, but from violence that gathers within, he said, adding in a passage that sent tents pitching across Washington. There's little cultural overlap between violent extremists abroad and violent extremists at home, Matt notes, but in their disdain for pluralism and their disregard for human life and their determination to defile national symbols, they are children of the same foul spirit, and it is our continuing duty to confront them. A few years ago, George W. Bush was on track to be remembered as one of the worst presidents of all time, if not the worst. He was both more disdainful and more ignorant of the law than Nixon, that the doc was talking about earlier. His arsonist economic stewardship was rivaled only by Hoover, and intellect-wise, he made Chester A. Arthur look like Copernicus. He was also a worse and more destructive president than Donald Trump, and it wasn't close. I make this point all the time. Trump talked big, but it was Bush who actually smashed norms on a grand scale, from international law to human rights to adherence to the most basic constitutional principles in pursuit of policies that Brown University just estimated cost $8 trillion. Okay, $8 trillion cost, but the real cost leading to 900,000 deaths. I mean, we're in that ballpark of 1 million deaths with George W. Bush, and the guy's parading around the country giving speeches. He's been on Ellen, dancing with Ellen. I mean, we've got a very short-term memory issue in this country, Doc.
We certainly do. And, the problem is that he is the guy that you wouldn't mind drinking a beer with and grilling some hamburgers. He has this sort of pleasant personality. He's self-deprecating. He's humorous and all that. And that makes it easy for a lot of people to say, he's a pretty nice guy, and, he wasn't so bad. But when you look at the Middle East, and that is a huge area, it includes, everything from Israel to Iran and Afghanistan. George W. Bush and his administration destabilized that area, created the environment in which we find ourselves now by essentially making horrible, horrible decisions. One of them is to have overthrown Saddam Hussein, who was a bad guy, but he was the only thing blocking Iran from expanding in the area and bringing war and terrorism to Lebanon, to Jordan, to Syria, to all those places, including Iraq. I mean, we fought a war in Iraq against Saddam Hussein, unleashed a lot of the religious sects that all were being sort of glued together and held in check by Saddam Hussein. And that all cracked apart. And then George W. Bush got us involved in Afghanistan. It wasn't Biden who got us in there. It wasn't Obama or Clinton. We went into Afghanistan, and we should have maybe taken out Osama bin Laden as a symbolic thing and declared victory and said, we can't change a country whose values and mores are completely different from ours and impose Western, progressive, feminist and other types of values on that society. That is just not going to work. But we did it. We have the two biggest American embassies in the world that cost billions of dollars, the two biggest embassies, Iraq and Afghanistan. Both of those embassies are useless now. You might as well put chickens in them because we're not there anymore. And so George W. Bush And Donald Trump was right. Donald Trump went after Bush. He did. Donald Trump went after Bush and said, this is the guy that's caused all these problems.
Went after
But
Bush's brother. Yeah.
Yeah. And we want to be romanticizing the past because the present is so uncertain. But that doesn't teach us any good lessons. You know, the lessons, I think the lessons are, and I talk to the left about this very much because the left is very, I call it haughty or aggressive about it. You have been pushing to, liberate women and create, women's colleges and get women into the cabinet and driving cars and stuff. Are we really in a position to impose that on other countries, or do they have to develop that desire for themselves? In Saudi Arabia, women's conditions have improved a great deal, but it's mostly because they have some new, younger leaders who are not very good guys, but they have their journalistic critics basically cut up with a bone saw and killed. As we know, yes. But on the other hand, they have changed a lot of the domestic policies and conditions. And women are driving cars in Saudi Arabia. Women are becoming professionals and holding jobs they never did before. But that came more internally, I think, and not because we told them to do it. And so, we have a foreign policy that has largely been unsuccessful. I mean, was unsuccessful in Vietnam. It's been unsuccessful in Cuba. The stupidest foreign policy in the world is to impose strict sanctions on Cuba, which hurt who? They don't hurt the government.
Civilian
they don't hurt
population.
The leaders.
Yes.
The civilian population. And it also gives the government a pushback that lets people go, well, yeah, the Americans are, pushing us and are our enemy and they're threatening. And so, okay, we'll put up with this communist government. It's been the most idiotic policy. I don't understand why Cuban Americans and other anti-communists in Florida, especially in other places, don't see that the worst thing you could do is what we have been doing for the last 60 years or more with Cuba, and that is to isolate them, to give the government an excuse to oppress people, and to punish the population. I mean, really? How hard is it to understand that? But then on the other hand, George, how freaking hard is it to understand that if you get a vaccine, you're likely not to get COVID, or if you get it, you're not going to go to the hospital, or even if you go to the hospital, you're likely to just go for light treatment and not stay there and then die. How hard is that to understand? And we've got a lot of, I would say, despicable cultural icons. Apparently, Nicki Minaj, who our listeners and viewers probably know, a great Black entertainer, just recently tweeted out to her millions of followers that the COVID vaccine is really dangerous and can cause side effects that are frightening like hell, and that her brother-in-law's friend and cousin and uncle somewhere in the Caribbean saw some people who were suffering from these side effects that were just horrific. Well, all those millions of her followers now are not going to get a vaccine. Who are these entertainment freakazoids, worthless little crap heads who are getting paid millions of dollars, who are celebrated heroes in our culture? There are few countries in the world where those people who are generally shallow and selfish are given the status of endorsing or not endorsing something like a vaccine. It's our culture is broken. It's not just our politics, George. Our culture is broken, and I am now a total pessimist. I'm a pessimist. I don't think we are going to scramble our way out of this, because it isn't just that, the elections, we need to improve voting and get more access to people to voting, which we should do. But you have to drill down much deeper into our society to find where the rot is. And there is a lot of rot. I love sailboats, and at my marina where I keep my sailboat, this nice old man came in with his beautiful, beautiful wooden sailboat and wanted it hauled out for the winter. And and the barnacles taken off the hull and stuff. The manager of the marina, who was a good friend of mine, said to him, "You got to scrap this boat. This boat is finished. This boat is rotten. There is nothing we can do that makes any sense to salvage this boat and to, bring it back to where it was."
Uh-oh.
I looked at that and I began to almost break down, because I thought, maybe we've reached that point in this country where rot is eating away at our very foundation. And how are we going to, essentially lift ourselves back up again? One of my good friends, who is a strategic analyst, said, the only way we're going to unify again, the only way we're going to give up all these divisions that are, many of them, very shallow and artificial, is if there is a massive terrorist attack bigger than September 11th, much more threatening and dangerous, that tells us that, as Benjamin Franklin said, we shall either hang together or we shall hang alone. And he managed to bring together a very divided constitutional convention, the fighting that was taking place, and say, we can't do this. If we fight amongst ourselves, we're finished. We're gonna be chopped up and eaten alive by the British and the French and all the others. We've got to give that up and find common ground. There's nobody in this country doing a great job finding that common ground for us.
Well, I perish the thought of another terrorist attack, but let's hope lessons are learned, because there's one thing we know we don't want to do, and it's what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, you mentioned this breakdown in America, Doc. It's easy to get pessimistic. I do as well. I tell folks that, what's the reason for this? Well, the American family broke down. I'm okay. We're not going to get into divorce and single parents and all that kind of stuff. Not going to talk about that today. My God, that would be about 10 podcasts in a row.
That's right.
The other thing that broke down in the country was fraternal organizations. And when I mean fraternal organizations, I mean groups that brought people together. They had their own shortcomings and deficiencies. I'm talking about things like the Shriners and, the Masons and the Odd Fellows even, and stuff like that. They had shortcomings, sure, but not as short as we are today with the people running around crawling in the windows at the Capitol building. But what they did have was kind of a fundamental for membership that kept people kind of in a common sense fold and made them behave like they had some sense. Well, the other thing that broke down, and I want to close with this, Doc, and we're running out of time, but I definitely wanted to get to this because you have more experience and knowledge in this area maybe than anyone, is the university setting, is in our educational system. That's what broke down too. Let me bring this up. Okay, this was just in USA Today. The headline is, Men are skipping college. Here's why that trend could have devastating consequences. And this was from the editors of USA Today. They said, our view, figuring out why men aren't enrolling in college must be a national priority. Department of Education should study how to reverse this trend. This fall, women outnumber men on 2-year and 4-year college campuses by millions. Nearly 60% of students are women, while only about 40% are men, an education gap that has been widening for decades. I wasn't even really aware of this. It says the problem has become even more acute as total enrollment has fallen by more than 1 million students over the past 5 years. The Wall Street Journal reports that men accounted for 71% of that decline. A half century ago, the numbers were almost exactly the opposite. A half century ago, folks, the Doc was starting out on his career of academia with men making up 60% of incoming freshmen. Back then, America knew why women were outnumbered. Sexist policies and social mores kept women on the sidelines. Now there's a little research to explain why fewer men are enrolling in higher education. A spokesman for the Department of Energy said the agency doesn't have an effort underway to explain what's going on. Well, okay, I know a guy that probably does know a little something about this. Doc, what say ye?
Yeah, give me a call, Department of Education, because what existed before was unfair. A lot of women with brilliant minds, great ambition, vision were kept from the system, and that was not right. And we implemented a very, very successful policies for all these 50 years that I've been a professor to basically bring more women into the education system. And it worked so well that it essentially overwhelmed the system, so that we don't have a men's study program at Iowa State. We have a women's studies program, because the assumption is, well, everything else is men anyway, so we need a women's studies program, to emphasize that gender. And men are essentially, I think, somewhat nervous, somewhat fearful. There's a lot of, I call it confusion about how do you interact with women. A lot of men in the education setting find themselves suddenly accused of sexual assault. We have that at Iowa State all the time, and at all colleges. Fraternities drink too much and things happen, and then there's this war against male fraternities. And so men are just essentially, I think, walking away from it. But the university, beyond that, beyond the gender gap, George, the university has become a lot of different tribes. We are divided by race. We're divided by political ideology. We are divided by all kinds of things which are encouraged in the name of diversity and opportunity and so on. And we're not talking to each other that much anymore. And I think, that is certainly something that's also happening in American society, so those things, rather than uniting us and creating an environment where we try to find the things that we have in common, our goal is to find the things that we don't have in common that makes us different, whatever the group is, from the other group, whether it's LGBTQ, whether it's Black or Latino or race, gender, political ideology. And so we are a war zone. The universities are becoming a war zone.
Wow.
Of conflicts over identity mostly. And that is I think, a consequence of identity politics, which we have in the rest of society as well.
Let me bring this up.
Yeah.
I want to bring this article back up because
Sure.
it gets right to what you're talking about here, and I want to get your reaction on this. A couple of more paragraphs.
Sure.
It says, theories abound. One is that the problem starts in K through 12, where boys are more likely to be held back, drop out, and have trouble learning to read. Now, higher rates of incarceration could explain why poor Black men don't go to college, but they don't explain why poor white men are even less likely to go. But it's hard to go to college if you're in jail, folks. Still, another theory is that the problem doesn't have to do with men at all. Instead, it's attributed to the fact that women have no choice but to go to college to access opportunities that men already have when they don't go. So what is clear is that there will be consequences for millions of men opting out of college and for their families. Because college graduates earn on average 56% more than high school grads, a difference that amounts to more than $1 million over a working lifetime. College grads on average are healthier, happier, have better marriages, and live longer too. And of course that has to do with economics. Economic downturns are less likely to turn into job loss. And then it goes on to talk a lot about this split between men and women, and the fact that women still don't have access to the same fields such as science, technology, engineering, and math, but equal opportunity is not a one-way street. Okay, let's leave that there. But Doc, they're talking about something which is painfully obvious with one glance today in the university setting, but you had to witness this kind of as an erosion, really, over decades.
Yeah, and in the last years, I became disillusioned and demoralized with the sorts of conflicts that were suddenly erupting in my class.
Wow.
Where I was accused of being, white privileged, and so why could I teach Latin American politics, even though I'm born in Latin America,
Colombia,
know more about Latin America than most freaking people in the world, and some student in the back from Puerto Rico or the Dominican Republic says that I shouldn't be teaching because I'm a white privilege. Those things shut down any communication and drive away people and are unproductive. And it happens at all levels. It happens with gender. I had a panel. I may have already talked about this. I'm old. I forget what I've talked about with you, George. But there was a panel of 3 of us who were all experts. One of them was gay. One of them was a Vietnam War veteran with very serious illness, and myself, considering myself a Latino. And we were talking about some issues related to Latin America. The director of the women's program at Iowa State raised her hand in the crowd at the Memorial Union and said, well, why isn't there a woman on this panel? And the answer, she said, there's no diversity. And I said, there is a lot of diversity. And I started speaking in Spanish to her in my perfect Colombian Spanish. I am a Latino. Why are you ignoring me? Why isn't it important that I'm there as a Latino? Yes, maybe there was a woman who also knew a lot about this topic, but let's not continuously confront each other and set off wars related to gender, to sexuality, to whatever else. We are a country that is on the path to continuous confrontation, continuous alienation. And people wonder why so many millions of people, support radical causes and so on. I don't know the answer to that, but it's certainly because we have cultivated confrontation, protest, me versus you, my religious freedom. You can't tell me what to do, my God, because my religious freedom says that I shouldn't be doing A, B, or C. Certainly ethnic and racial, grievances. We are a country, of aggrieved people. We don't appreciate the things we have that are pretty good. There are still some things that are pretty good in this country. I mean, Medicare is pretty good. You people really want to lose Medicare? It may not be perfect. And
let's expand it. Let's have Medicare for everybody. I mean, it's been proven, folks, in a pandemic particularly. I mean, that would be, I love that, Doc.
Sure, and let's have Medicaid for people who are low income. Yeah. Let's do that. And we have it. Let's say that Social Security is one of the most important things that's ever happened in this country to raise the level of living and the standard of living of older people and retired people. Before Social Security, people generally didn't save 1 cent, and when they got old and lost their job, they went into total poverty, into homes for, homeless people, or moving in with relatives. And we're undermining Social Security and saying, well, it's just another pyramid scheme and so on. Why don't we appreciate the things we've done that actually have helped us a lot to be, somewhat prosperous and have some reason to be happy. We can't seem to want to be happy. We want to be unhappy. We want to be bitching about everything. And that's just the way we are. I don't see that changing very much.
Well, it's kind of sometimes can be the nature of podcast by George. I'll be guilty of bitching once in a while, but Doc, it's a wide-ranging conversation today. I knew that it would be, pal. I mean, this is great.
And it's good to bitch, but then to fall back and say, on the other hand, we have a lot of things to be grateful for, and let's try not to fight with each other so much. Imagine if a company, every time they had a meeting, they would start talking about the thing that divides the committee that's supposed to plan a marketing plan or a finance plan. And they start screaming at each other and accusing each other of things. I mean, how would that work? The company would go bankrupt. What you do when you have meetings or in a university, let's stop yelling at each other. Let's get together and talk about things that we can agree on, that we can build on, and leave the things that divide us to be resolved in some other way, but not with the confrontation, because it immediately drives away everyone who doesn't want to be part of the particular confrontation that's taking place. And that's what's happening in this country politically and socially.
probably putting on a set of bison horns and grabbing a spear and crawling through a
There
window.
you go.
Ain't gonna work. All right, Doc. We've gone longer than normal, quite a bit longer, but I mean that's just the way it is. This is a great show. I really appreciate it, Doc. Thanks again for coming on Podcast by George.
Thank you, sir. It's always a great pleasure to be with you, George.
Folks, that's Stephen W. Schmidt, Dr. Politics, as he's known, the guy that wrote the book that's off of my left side here that I should read more often and more of, and probably you should too. I want to recommend American Politics, American Government, and Politics today. But, folks, if you like Podcast by George, now it's free, and we're available just about everywhere. You can get us on YouTube. You can get us on Facebook, iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music has us. I mean, any place you see podcasts listed, find Podcast by George. Put it in quote marks. That helps a little bit. Podcast by George. And search us out. Or just go to podcastbygeorge.com, the website for the show. Pick an icon where you'd like to subscribe, and you're in. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.